Tonight, we're traveling back over 3,000 years to ancient Egypt, where cats weren't just pets, but sacred beings walking among pharaohs and common people alike. We'll explore the mysterious goddess Bastet, uncover why Egyptians worshipped felines, and discover the fascinating archaeological evidence that reveals just how deeply cats were woven into the fabric of this ancient civilization. This is a journey through time, myth, and the purring companions that once ruled the Nile. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of Egyptian history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Have you ever wondered why cats held such a special place in ancient Egyptian culture? Let me take you back to a time when the Nile Delta stretched fertile and green, and in every home, temple, and palace, cats walked with an authority that even pharaohs respected. The answer lies in something beautifully practical and deeply spiritual at the same time. You see, ancient Egypt's entire civilization depended on grain. Wheat and barley weren't just food, they were currency, power, and survival itself. The massive granaries that lined the Nile held the wealth of kingdoms. But there was a problem, a constant threat that could destroy everything. Rats and mice swarmed these storage facilities, consuming precious grain and spreading disease. Enter the cat, nature's perfect hunter. Around 4000 BCE, wildcats called Felis sylvestris libica began appearing near human settlements along the Nile. These weren't the domestic cats we know today. They were lean, fierce hunters with sandy coats that blended into the desert landscape. But something remarkable happened. These wild cats discovered that human grain stores attracted rodents, lots of them, and humans discovered that these cats were incredibly efficient at solving their rodent problem. It was a partnership born of mutual benefit. Archaeological evidence from the ancient site of Hierakonpolis shows cat bones dating back to 3700 BCE, buried near human remains in ways that suggest they were valued members of the community. But the relationship went far beyond pest control. The ancient Egyptians were keen observers of nature, and they noticed something special about cats. These animals embodied qualities they deeply admired. Cats were protective mothers, fierce when defending their young. They were graceful, moving with a fluid elegance that seemed almost supernatural. They had keen senses, able to see in the dark and hear the slightest sound. And perhaps most mysteriously, their eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, reflecting light in a way that must have seemed magical to ancient peoples. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, wrote extensive observations about Egyptian cat worship. He noted with amazement that when a house caught fire, Egyptians would prioritize saving their cats over their possessions. He described how cats were so revered that harming one, even accidentally, could result in death. Now, Herodotus had a tendency to exaggerate, but archaeological evidence supports the core of his claims. Mummified cats have been found by the hundreds of thousands, carefully preserved with the same techniques used for human nobility. In the city of Bubastis, located in the Nile Delta, archaeologists have uncovered enormous cat cemeteries. In the late 1800s, an Egyptian farmer stumbled upon a massive tomb containing an estimated 80,000 cat mummies. These weren't just random burials. Each cat had been carefully wrapped in linen, some with painted faces, placed in wooden or bronze caskets, and buried with ceremony. This tells us that cats weren't simply useful animals. They were sacred, believed to be living embodiments of divine power. The reverence for cats was so strong that Egyptian law protected them fiercely. When a cat died in a household, the entire family would go into mourning, shaving their eyebrows as a sign of grief. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded an incident where a Roman soldier accidentally killed a cat, and despite intervention from Egyptian officials and even the Roman authorities trying to protect him, an angry mob killed the soldier. This happened during a time when Egypt was under Roman control, showing that even political power couldn't override the sacred status of cats. But why this particular animal? Ancient Egypt had many animals considered sacred, from crocodiles to ibises to bulls. What made cats so special? Part of it was their dual nature. Cats could be gentle, purring contentedly in someone's lap, grooming themselves with meticulous care. But in an instant, they could transform into deadly hunters, all claws and teeth and lightning reflexes. This duality fascinated the Egyptians, who saw in it a reflection of their gods, beings who could be benevolent and nurturing but also fierce and destructive. The Egyptians also noticed the connection between cats and the sun. Cats loved to bask in sunlight, and their eyes seemed to mirror the sun's power, glowing gold and green. In a culture where the sun god Ra was supreme, this solar connection elevated cats to a cosmic level. Some Egyptian texts describe the sun god himself taking the form of a cat to battle the serpent of chaos, Apophis, each night in the underworld. Every sunrise was proof that the divine cat had won another victory over the forces of darkness. There's something deeply peaceful about imagining this ancient relationship. Picture the Nile at sunset, the water turning gold and orange. In a small mud brick house, a family sits down to their evening meal. Nearby, a sleek cat watches through half-closed eyes, having spent the day patrolling the grain storage, keeping it safe from mice. The family members believe this cat carries within it a spark of the divine, a piece of the goddess herself. When the cat purrs, it's not just contentment, it's a blessing. When it hunts, it's performing a sacred duty. The cat isn't owned, it's honoured. It isn't merely tolerated, it's loved. This relationship between humans and cats in ancient Egypt represents one of history's most successful animal domestications, but also one of the most spiritually significant. The Egyptians didn't just use cats, they elevated them, wove them into their understanding of the cosmos, and in doing so, created a bond that would influence how humans view cats for thousands of years to come. Even today, when a cat walks into a room with that particular feline confidence, a tail held high, there's an echo of ancient Egypt, a memory of a time when cats were worshipped as gods, and they absolutely knew it. Chapter 2. Bastet Rising, the goddess who wore the cat's face. Who exactly was Bastet, and how did a goddess transform from a fierce lioness into the gentle cat deity we know today? This is a story of transformation that spans over 2,000 years of Egyptian history, and it reveals how the ancient Egyptians' understanding of divine power evolved over millennia. Let me take you back to Egypt's Old Kingdom, around 2890 BCE. In this era, Bastet first appears in historical records, but she looks very different from the cat-headed goddess we typically imagine. Early depictions show her as a fierce lioness, or as a woman with a lioness head, nearly indistinguishable from other fierce goddesses like Sekhmet. Her name, Bastet, likely comes from bast, meaning ointment jar, and the feminine suffix et. She was associated with precious oils, perfumes, and protective ointments, but also with the destructive heat of the sun. In these early centuries, Bastet was a solar deity, a daughter of the sun god Ra. Egyptian mythology tells of how Ra sent his eye, manifested as a fierce lioness, to punish humanity for plotting against him. This lioness raged across Egypt, slaughtering humans with such fury that Ra himself became concerned she would destroy all of humanity. To stop her rampage, the gods flooded the fields with beer mixed with red ochre to resemble blood. The lioness drank deeply, became intoxicated, and her rage subsided. She transformed from a destroyer into a protector. This myth was associated with several goddesses, including Sekhmet and Hathor. But Bastet was part of this fierce, divine feminine energy. She was dangerous, a warrior goddess who protected the pharaoh in battle. Inscriptions from the pyramid texts refer to the king as a lion in battle, under the protection of leonine goddesses. Bastet guarded the pharaoh's power and struck down his enemies without mercy. But something fascinating happened during the Middle Kingdom. Around 2055 to 1650 BCE, Egypt was changing. The country had emerged from a period of chaos and was experiencing cultural and religious shifts. Local gods were gaining importance, and regional worship centres were developing their own theological interpretations. Bastet's primary cult centre was the city of Bubastis in the eastern Nile Delta. As Bubastis grew in importance, so did its patron goddess, and she began to change. The transformation from lioness to cat happened gradually. By the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, Bastet was increasingly depicted as a domestic cat, or a woman with a cat's head, often holding a sistrum, a musical instrument, and sometimes accompanied by kittens at her feet. This wasn't just an artistic choice, it reflected a theological evolution. As Sekhmet became more firmly established as the fierce lioness goddess of Memphis, Bastet took on a gentler aspect, though she never completely lost her protective warrior nature. Why did this transformation occur? Scholars believe it reflects the domestication of cats and their increasing importance in daily Egyptian life. As cats became more integrated into households, protecting grain and living alongside families, the Egyptians developed a more intimate, affectionate relationship with them. Bastet evolved to reflect this bond. She became associated with home, fertility, childbirth, and the protection of women and children. She was a mother goddess, often shown with kittens, representing nurturing and family. The sanctuary at Bubastis became one of Egypt's most important religious sites. Herodotus visited it in the 5th century BCE and described it as one of the most beautiful temples in all of Egypt. He wrote that the annual Festival of Bastet drew over 700,000 pilgrims, making it potentially the largest religious gathering in the ancient world. Archaeological excavations at the site, conducted in the 19th and 20th centuries, have revealed a massive temple complex dedicated to the goddess, surrounded by the enormous cat cemeteries I mentioned earlier. These festivals were extraordinary events. Herodotus describes boats filled with pilgrims travelling down the Nile toward Bubastis, the air filled with music from flutes and rattles. Women would shake sistrums, the sacred rattles associated with Bastet, creating a rhythmic sound that accompanied prayers and songs. When boats passed villages, pilgrims would shout and make jokes, creating an atmosphere of joy and celebration. This wasn't a somber religious event, it was a party, a celebration of life, fertility, and divine protection. Once at Bubastis, the festival included feasting, dancing, and drinking vast quantities of wine. This might seem surprising for a religious event, but it made perfect sense in Egyptian theology. Bastet's transformation from rage to contentment in the myth of the sun's eye was brought about by intoxication. Wine and celebration were ways to honour the goddess and participate in the mythic pattern of transforming dangerous energy into protective, nurturing power. The evidence for Bastet worship is extensive. Bronze statues of the goddess as a seated cat have been found throughout Egypt, often showing exquisite craftsmanship. These weren't just religious icons for temples, they were personal items kept in homes as protective amulets. Many show Bastet wearing a broad collar necklace and earrings, signs of her divine status. Some hold a sistrum in one paw and wear a basket, her hieroglyphic symbol, on their heads. The fact that these statues were mass-produced tells us that Bastet worship wasn't limited to the elite. Common people also sought her protection and blessing. Inscriptions and prayers to Bastet reveal what people asked of her. Mothers prayed for her protection during childbirth. Families asked her to guard their homes. Young women sought her blessing for fertility and successful marriages. Musicians and dancers considered her their patron, since she was associated with joy, music, and celebration. The sistrum she carried wasn't just a symbol, it was a real instrument used in her worship, and its rattling sound was believed to drive away evil spirits. Bastet's mythology connected her to other major deities in complex ways. She was sometimes considered the wife of Ptah, the creator god, and mother of Mahes, a lion-headed war god. This family connection linked her to Memphis, another major religious center, and to royal power. She was also associated with the Eye of Ra, that powerful solar symbol that could be both destructive and protective. In some texts, she's called the soul of Isis, connecting her to Egypt's greatest goddess. What's particularly beautiful about Bastet is how she embodies balance. She's fierce but gentle, solar but also lunar, wild but domestic, a warrior who dances, a protector who celebrates life. This complexity made her accessible to many different people for many different reasons. A soldier going into battle might pray to Bastet the lioness for courage. A pregnant woman might pray to Bastet the cat for a safe delivery. A musician might honour her with song. She contained multitudes. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine the great temple at Bubastis at sunset. The massive stone walls are painted with images of the goddess in her cat form, eyes outlined in black, collar gleaming with gold leaf. In the sanctuary, priests perform the evening ritual, offering food and water to the statue of the goddess. The sound of sistrums fills the air, a gentle rhythmic shaking that seems to pulse with the heartbeat of the world. Somewhere in the temple complex, sacred cats walk freely, fed and honoured by the priests, living embodiments of the goddess herself. The incense smoke rises in the fading light, carrying prayers up to the heavens, while the Nile flows eternally nearby, and cats, both in the temple and in homes throughout the city, settle down for the night, their purring like a prayer, their presence a blessing. Chapter 3. The Science of the Sacred. Archaeological evidence of cat worship. What physical evidence remains today that proves ancient Egyptians truly worshipped cats the way the ancient texts claim? The archaeological record provides stunning proof that the reverence for cats in ancient Egypt was real, widespread, and lasted for thousands of years. Let's start with the cat mummies, because the sheer scale of this practice is breathtaking. In 1888, an Egyptian farmer near the village of Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt was digging and discovered something unexpected. He'd found a vast underground cemetery, but not for humans. It was filled with cat mummies, thousands upon thousands of them, wrapped in linen and stacked in corridors that stretched into darkness. Word spread, and soon the sight attracted attention from dealers and archaeologists alike. What happened next is both fascinating and tragic. From a modern archaeological perspective, a company purchased the contents of the tomb, roughly 80,000 cat mummies, weighing about 19 tons in total. But instead of preserving them for study, they shipped them to Liverpool, England, where most were ground up and sold as fertilizer, valued for their phosphate content. Only a handful of specimens were saved for museums. By today's standards, this is horrifying, the destruction of priceless archaeological evidence. But it tells us something important. Cat mummies were so abundant in Egypt that late 19th century people didn't realize their historical value. Fortunately, other cat cemeteries were treated with more care. Excavations at sites like Bubastis, Saqqara, and Abydos have uncovered extensive cat burial grounds where archaeologists could properly study the remains. What they found was remarkable. The cats had been mummified with genuine care and expense. The process involved removing the internal organs, treating the body with natron, a natural salt that dried out the tissues, and wrapping it in linen strips. Some mummies were quite simple, but others were elaborate, with decorative wrappings arranged in geometric patterns and faces painted on the linen to represent the cat's features. CT scanning of cat mummies has revealed fascinating details. Many of the cats were young, between 4 months and 2 years old. This has led to significant scholarly debate. Were these beloved pets who died naturally, or were cats bred specifically for mummification and ritual sacrifice? The evidence suggests both practices existed. Some mummies show signs of natural death or disease, carefully preserved out of love. But the sheer numbers and the young age of many cats suggests that temple complexes bred cats specifically for pilgrims to purchase, mummify, and offer to Bastet. This might sound cruel to modern ears, but we need to understand it in the context of Egyptian religious practice. Offering an animal mummy to a god was a way of creating a permanent prayer, a lasting connection to the divine. The animal became an eternal intermediary between the worshipper and the deity. It wasn't viewed as killing a cat, it was transforming a cat into something sacred and eternal. The cat's spirit would join Bastet in the divine realm, carrying the prayers and wishes of the person who offered it. But not all archaeological evidence involves death. Excavations at residential sites have uncovered cat bones showing that cats lived in homes, ate food scraps, and were part of family life. At the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, where the artisans who built the royal tombs lived, cat bones have been found in household contexts, along with artistic depictions of cats sitting under chairs or eating fish. These were pets, companions, living alongside humans in daily life. The artistic evidence is equally compelling. Tomb paintings from the New Kingdom frequently show cats in domestic scenes. In the tomb of Nakht, a scribe from the 18th dynasty, there's a beautiful image of a cat sitting beneath a chair during a banquet scene. In the tomb of Ipuy, another artisan's tomb, a cat is shown holding a fish in its paws. These aren't formal religious images, they're snapshots of daily life, showing that cats were present in Egyptian homes, just as they are in many homes today. One particularly famous artifact is the cat sarcophagus of Prince Thutmose, son of Amenhotep III, who lived around 1400 BCE. This limestone sarcophagus was carved for the prince's beloved cat named Meow, which means she-cat. The inscription reads, "The Osiris, the Lady Meow." The use of Osiris as a title, typically reserved for deceased humans, shows that this cat was granted the same afterlife status as a person. This wasn't just a pet, it was a family member who would continue to exist in the afterlife. The sarcophagus is beautifully carved, with Meow's name carefully inscribed in hieroglyphs, a level of honor that demonstrates genuine love. Scientific studies of ancient Egyptian cats have also revealed how domestication progressed. DNA analysis of mummified cats shows that the ancient Egyptians were breeding cats, selecting for certain traits like docility and appearance. These cats were distinct from the wild African wildcats, but also different from modern domestic breeds. They represent an intermediate stage in cat domestication, a unique population that existed specifically in ancient Egypt. Skeletal analysis shows these cats were well fed. Their bones display few signs of malnutrition or disease, suggesting they were cared for attentively. Some show healed fractures, evidence that injured cats were nursed back to health rather than abandoned. This contradicts the notion that cats were valued only for practical purposes. The care taken to heal injured animals demonstrates emotional attachment. The archaeological site of Bubastis provides perhaps the most comprehensive evidence. Excavations began in the 1882 under Edouard Neville and continued sporadically through the 20th century. The temple complex covered a massive area with a great hall, multiple courtyards, and sanctuaries. Statues of Bastet lined the processional ways, priests' quarters, administrative buildings, and the enormous cat cemeteries surrounded the main temple. This was a major religious and economic centre, supporting hundreds of priests and workers, all devoted to the worship of the cat goddess. Inscriptions found at the site record donations to the temple, including land, gold, and grain. Pharaohs sponsored building projects there, adding pylons, obelisks, and statues. This royal patronage shows that Bastet worship wasn't a minor folk practice, it was state-sponsored religion at the highest levels. Ramesses II, one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, built extensively at Bubastis, and his cartouche appears on monuments there. One particularly moving type of evidence comes from personal amulets and jewellery. Small cat figurines made of bronze, faience, a glazed ceramic material, or carved from semi-precious stones have been found by the thousands. These were worn as protective charms. A pregnant woman might wear a cat amulet to invoke Bastet's protection. A child might have one to ward off illness. These weren't expensive luxury items for the rich. They were mass-produced, affordable to common people, showing how deeply cat worship penetrated all levels of society. Written evidence complements the physical archaeology. Papyrus texts include hymns to Bastet, praising her beauty, her protective power, and her role as defender of Ra. Medical texts invoke her name in healing spells, asking for her assistance in curing illness. Legal documents show temple properties dedicated to her worship. Administrative records detail the rations provided to temple cats and the priests who cared for them. All of this creates a comprehensive picture of a society where cats and the goddess who embodied them were central to both religious life and daily existence. As you relax and let these images wash over you, picture the moment of discovery when archaeologists first opened those ancient cat cemeteries. Imagine the flickering light of their torches illuminating corridor after corridor, filled with carefully wrapped bundles, each one a cat that lived and died thousands of years ago, each one placed there by hands that believed in the sacredness of these creatures. The silence of the tomb, the dust of millennia, and underneath it all, the preserved remains of animals that were loved, honoured, and worshipped. It's a connection across vast time, a thread linking us to people who looked at cats and saw divinity, who couldn't imagine a home without the soft pad of paws and the comforting rumble of purring. Chapter 4. A Day in Ancient Egypt, Living with Sacred Cats. What would it actually feel like to wake up in ancient Egypt, where cats were sacred, and live a day alongside these divine creatures? Let me paint a picture for you, grounded in archaeological evidence and historical texts, of what daily life with cats was truly like in this remarkable civilization. The sun rises over the Nile, and in a modest home in Thebes, around 1250 BCE, a family begins to stir. The house is made of mud brick, its walls plastered and painted white to reflect the fierce Egyptian sun. Small windows near the ceiling allow light and air to enter, while keeping the interior relatively cool. In the corner of the main room, on a woven reed mat, a sleek cat stretches, its tawny coat catching the early morning light. The woman of the house, Mutemwia, rises first. She's the wife of a craftsman who works on the pharaoh's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Before beginning her morning tasks, she pauses at a small household shrine set into a wall niche. There sits a bronze statue of Bastet, no bigger than her hand, the cat-headed goddess holding a sistrum. Mutemwia pours a small amount of water and places a bit of bread at the statue's base, whispering a prayer for the health of her children and the safety of her husband in the dangerous tomb work. This simple ritual is her daily connection to the divine, and the presence of the real cat in her home makes the goddess feel closer, more real, more protective. The cat, which the family calls Miut, meaning simply cat, approaches and rubs against Mutemwia's legs. This isn't demanding, it's a greeting, an affectionate ritual they perform each morning. She reaches down and strokes the cat's back, feeling the warmth of its fur, and there's comfort in this, a moment of peace before the busy day begins. Archaeological evidence tells us that Egyptian cats were affectionate companions, that the relationship wasn't purely functional. Mutemwia moves to the kitchen area, where grain is stored in large ceramic jars sealed with cloth and clay. This is why Meow is so valuable to the household. Without cats, rats and mice would devastate these food supplies, and the family would face hunger. But it's more than economic calculation. When Mutemwia looks at Meow, she sees a creature that embodies grace, that hunts with divine precision, that purrs with contentment when the household is at peace. The cat is a barometer of the home's spiritual health, a living blessing. The children wake next, a boy of 7 and a girl of 4. They immediately seek out Meow, and the cat tolerates their attention with patient dignity. The boy has been taught to be gentle, to respect the cat as a sacred being. He's heard the stories of Bastet, how the goddess can be fierce, if angered, but loving to those who honour her. He offers Meow a small piece of fish left from last night's dinner, and the cat accepts it delicately, eating with that fastidious care that cats display. The girl tries to put a string of beads around the cat's neck, and Meow endures this for a moment before slipping away with that liquid feline grace, jumping onto a bench where the sun streams through a window. The father, K.M. Wasset, prepares for work. He's a painter of tombs, skilled in the sacred art of creating eternal images for the dead. Before leaving, he too acknowledges the household shrine, asking Bastet to protect his family while he's away in the necropolis. He's seen the cat mummies in the tombs he decorates, carefully placed there as offerings, as guardians, as eternal companions for the deceased. The boundary between life and death seems thinner when you work surrounded by images of eternity, and the living cat in his home feels like an anchor to the world of the living, a promise of continuity. After the family's breakfast of bread and beer, Mutemwia sets out to the market. Meow follows her to the doorway and then settles in a patch of sun just outside, becoming the neighbourhood watch cat. Other cats roam the streets, some attached to specific households, others living more freely, tolerated and fed by multiple families. There's a community of cats here, just as there's a community of humans, and they coexist in a way that benefits both. At the market, Mutemwia passes a vendor selling cat amulets, small faience figurines of Bastet in her cat form, glazed in bright blue-green. These are affordable protective charms, and she considers buying one for her daughter, who's been complaining of bad dreams. The belief is that Bastet amulets worn at night will protect sleeping children from nightmares and evil spirits. It's a fusion of practical parenting and religious faith that makes perfect sense in this culture. She also passes the fish sellers, and she purchases a small portion, partly for the family's dinner but also because Meow prefers fish to other foods, and keeping the cat well fed and content is part of honouring Bastet. The fish seller has his own cat sitting near the stall, guarding against the rodents that are attracted to the fish smell. The cats of the market are working cats, earning their keep, but they're also treated with respect, given water on hot days, and never shooed away roughly. Meanwhile, across the river in the necropolis, Kamwaset is at work in a tomb. The walls he's painting show the deceased's life, and in one scene, a cat sits under a chair during a feast, just as Meow sits in his own home. He's careful with this detail, making the cat's eyes large and outlined in black, giving it the dignity it deserves. He knows that this painted cat will exist for eternity, that thousands of years from now, if the gods will it, someone might see this image and know that cats were cherished in this age. He uses expensive pigments, ground minerals mixed with binding agents, the same materials used for painting the gods themselves, because this cat, even in painted form, deserves honour. During the midday heat, work stops. It's too hot to labour safely, and Kamwaset and his fellow craftsmen rest in the shade, sharing water and bread. They talk about their families, and one man mentions that his cat recently had kittens. There's a discussion about whether to keep one or give them to families that need good mousers. Another worker says his cat died last month, and his household went into mourning, shaving their eyebrows as tradition requires. There's genuine grief in his voice. This wasn't just an animal that died, it was a family member, a connection to the divine presence in his home. Back in the city, the afternoon brings different activities. Mutemwaya works on weaving, sitting in the shade of her courtyard, and Mute lies nearby, occasionally grooming or sleeping that deep, twitching sleep where paws move and whiskers quiver, chasing dream prey through dream fields. The rhythmic sound of the loom and the quiet presence of the cat create a peaceful atmosphere. When the children return from playing, hot and dusty, the first thing they do is look for Mute, as if checking that the household's luck, its divine blessing, is still present. As evening approaches, the family eats together. Mute receives portions of fish and some milk in a ceramic bowl. In wealthier households, cats might eat from specially made dishes, even bowls of bronze or decorated pottery. But in this home, the cat shares the same simple ceramics the family uses, and that's enough. What matters isn't luxury but care, the daily feeding, the providing of water, the ensuring of the cat's comfort and health. After dinner, as the sun sets and the house grows dim, Mutemwia lights oil lamps. The flickering light makes shadows dance on the walls, and Mute's eyes catch the light, glowing gold and green, that reflective quality that must have seemed so magical to ancient peoples. The children watch the cat's glowing eyes with fascination, and their mother tells them the story of how Ra, in the form of a great cat, battles the serpent Apophis every night in the underworld, ensuring that the sun will rise again tomorrow. The cat's glowing eyes are proof of this divine battle, a connection to the cosmic struggle between order and chaos. As the family prepares for sleep, laying out reed mats in the main room where it's cooler than the upper chambers, Mute circles and chooses a spot near the children. The cat's presence is protective, a guardian against the spirits of the night, against bad dreams, against the unknown threats that darkness brings. When Mute purrs, a deep, rumbling vibration, it's like a prayer, like the rhythm of the universe itself, and the family falls asleep to that sound, feeling safe, feeling blessed. This daily reality, reconstructed from archaeological evidence, from tomb paintings, from household artifacts and written texts, shows us that the relationship between ancient Egyptians and cats was complex, layered, and deeply meaningful. It was practical, yes. Cats protected food supplies. It was religious. Cats were manifestations of divine power. But it was also emotional. Cats were family members, companions, sources of comfort and joy. When we look at the evidence, the mummies and the amulets and the paintings, we're not seeing a strange, alien practice. We're seeing a relationship that would be recognizable to any cat owner today, that bond between human and feline that transcends time and culture. Chapter 5. The Festival of Bubastis, when all Egypt celebrated the cat goddess. Can you imagine a religious festival so joyous that 700,000 people would travel from across the country to celebrate it, all in honor of a cat goddess? This was the Festival of Bastet at Bubastis, one of the most spectacular events in ancient Egyptian culture, and we know about it from both ancient accounts and archaeological evidence. The festival took place annually during the second month of the Egyptian season of emergence, which corresponds roughly to April or May in our calendar. This was after the Nile's flood had receded, crops were growing, and the agricultural year was well underway. It was a time of optimism, of life renewing itself, making it perfect for celebrating Bastet, the goddess of fertility, joy, and protection. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, left us the most detailed description of the festival, and while we must account for his outsider's perspective and tendency toward exaggeration, his account aligns with archaeological findings. He wrote that the journey to Bubastis was almost as important as the festival itself. Pilgrims would travel by boat down the Nile, and these weren't solemn, quiet processions. The boats were packed with people, and the air rang with music. Picture the river dotted with hundreds of boats, sails billowing, oars splashing. On each boat, women played sistrums, those sacred rattles associated with Bastet. The sound of hundreds of sistrums shaking in rhythm would create an incredible noise, a metallic, rattling pulse that carried across the water. Men played flutes, their melodies weaving through the percussion. People sang, their voices rising in hymns to the goddess, but also in secular songs, jokes, and bawdy verses. This was celebration without restraint. When the boats passed villages along the riverbank, Herodotus tells us, the pilgrims would call out to the people on shore. Some villagers would join the procession if they could, jumping aboard boats or launching their own. Others would stay on land, but participate by shouting back, by dancing on the banks, by lifting their robes in ritual gestures of fertility and blessing. The entire journey became a moving celebration, transforming the Nile into a highway of joy. Archaeological excavations at Bubastis have revealed how the city prepared for this massive influx of pilgrims. The temple complex was enormous, capable of holding thousands of worshippers at once. The main temple sat on an island in the middle of the city, surrounded by a canal fed by the Nile. This created a sacred space set apart from the everyday world. Naville's excavations in the 1882 uncovered the temple's layout. Massive stone gateways, columned halls with capitals carved in the shape of sistrum handles, and multiple courtyards where ceremonies could take place. The centerpiece was the sanctuary of Bastet herself, where a statue of the goddess resided. This wasn't accessible to common pilgrims. Only priests could enter the innermost shrine. But during the festival, the statue would be brought out in procession, carried on a sacred barque, a ceremonial boat, so that the people could see their goddess and she could see them. The statue was likely made of gold or gilded wood, with inlaid eyes of semi-precious stones that would seem to gaze out at the crowds with divine awareness. When pilgrims arrived at Bubastis, they would have been greeted by the sight of the temple rising above the city, its walls covered in relief carvings and inscriptions, its flagpoles bearing bright banners. The approach to the temple was lined with statues, many of them depicting seated cats or the cat-headed goddess. These statues were offerings from previous pilgrims, from pharaohs and commoners alike, each one a permanent prayer, a lasting presence in the holy space. The festival itself lasted several days and involved multiple elements. There were formal religious ceremonies conducted by priests, offerings made to the goddess, including food, wine, flowers, and incense. Bulls were sacrificed, their meat distributed to feed the crowds. The smell of roasting meat, burning incense, blooming flowers, and the press of thousands of human bodies would have created an intense sensory experience. But what made this festival unique was the atmosphere of joy and even licentiousness that Herodotus describes. He states that more wine was consumed during this festival than during the entire rest of the year in Egypt. A clear exaggeration, but one that emphasizes the celebratory nature of the event. Drinking wasn't seen as sacrilege, it was part of the worship, a reenactment of the myth where the lioness goddess's rage was soothed by beer, transforming her from destroyer to protector. Music and dance were central to the celebration. Professional musicians and dancers performed in the temple courtyards, but ordinary pilgrims also danced, moved by wine, by religious fervour, by the sheer joy of being part of this massive communal celebration. The sound of sistrums was constant, creating a rhythmic backdrop to everything, a sound that was believed to please the goddess and drive away evil spirits. Women played a particularly important role in Bastet's festival. The goddess was associated with feminine power, with sexuality, fertility, and motherhood, and women worshipped her with special fervour. Some scholars believe that ritual acts of sexuality may have been part of the festival, sacred unions performed to honour the goddess of fertility and ensure the land's continued abundance. If this seems shocking, remember that ancient Egyptian religion didn't have the same boundaries between sacred and sexual that later cultures would impose. The creation of life was divine, and celebrating it openly was a way of honouring the gods. Pilgrims also came to the festival with specific requests and offerings. Archaeologists have found thousands of bronze cat statues at Bubastis, left there by worshippers seeking the goddess's favour. A woman hoping to conceive might offer a statue showing Bastet with kittens. A family grateful for recovery from illness might dedicate a cat statue in thanks. Musicians and dancers would offer sistrums, sometimes real bronze instruments, sometimes miniature representations. And then there were the cat mummies. Pilgrims could purchase a mummified cat from the temple, already prepared by the priests, and offer it as a permanent prayer. These cats were bred and raised in the temple precincts specifically for this purpose. After being ritually killed, likely by breaking the neck quickly to minimize suffering, they were mummified and placed in the vast underground cemeteries that surrounded the temple. X-ray studies of these mummies show that most were young cats, killed in their first year or two of life. To modern sensibilities, this seems cruel, but in the context of ancient Egyptian religion, these cats weren't being destroyed. They were being transformed into eternal divine messengers, their spirits joining Bastet in the realm of the gods. The economic impact of the festival was enormous. Bubastis would have had a permanent infrastructure to support it. Inns for pilgrims, markets selling food and religious items, workshops producing cat statues and amulets, bakers and brewers working overtime to feed the crowds. The temple owned vast tracts of agricultural land, and the produce from these estates helped fund the festival and support the priests and workers year-round. There was also a darker economic aspect. The mass production of cat mummies meant breeding operations, catteries where thousands of cats were raised specifically to be killed and mummified. Archaeologists have found evidence of these catteries at various temple sites. It was an industry, religious in purpose, but industrial in scale. And it tells us how deeply economic and religious life were intertwined in ancient Egypt. As evening fell during the festival, the temple would be illuminated with thousands of oil lamps, their flickering light making the carved reliefs seem to move, bringing the images of Bastet to life. The glow would be visible from across the city, a beacon of divine presence. Pilgrims who had been celebrating all day would begin to settle, some finding places to sleep in the temple courtyards, others in homes of Bubastis residents who rented space, still others simply curling up in boats along the canal. The final day of the festival involved a grand procession. The statue of Bastet, which had been kept in the sanctuary, was brought out one last time. Priests carried it on the sacred bark through the streets of Bubastis, allowing everyone to see the goddess in her glory. The crowd would have surged forward, desperate for a glimpse, calling out prayers and praises. Children would have been lifted onto shoulders for a better view. The sick and injured would have reached out, believing that proximity to the goddess could heal them. After the procession returned to the temple and the statue was placed back in the sanctuary, pilgrims would begin their journey home. The boats would head back up and down the Nile, the passengers exhausted but spiritually renewed, carrying with them blessed amulets, holy water from the temple, perhaps a small cat statue or a bit of incense. They would return to their villages and cities with stories of the magnificent festival, with the memory of music and wine and the presence of the goddess. The festival of Bastet at Bubastis continued for centuries, surviving changes in dynasty, foreign invasions, and cultural shifts. It persisted because it met deep human needs, the need for community, for celebration, for connection to the divine, for a break from the routine of daily life. Even when Egypt came under Greek and then Roman rule, the festival continued, though gradually changing and eventually fading as Christianity spread through the region. Today, the site of Bubastis is largely ruins, excavated and studied, but nothing like its ancient glory. The temple has long since fallen, its stones carried away to build other structures, its glory faded. But in those ruins, archaeologists have found the evidence of what once was: the cat mummies, the statues, the inscriptions praising Bastet, the layout of the great temple. These remains let us reconstruct, at least in imagination, what it must have been like when Bubastis was alive with celebration, when the goddess was honoured by hundreds of thousands, when cats were worshipped as divine. Chapter 6: Cats and the Afterlife. Eternal companions. What role did cats play in ancient Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife, and why were they considered essential companions for the journey beyond the grave? The answer reveals some of the most profound aspects of Egyptian spirituality and shows us how deeply cats were woven into their understanding of existence itself. The ancient Egyptians had an extraordinarily complex and detailed understanding of death and the afterlife. Death wasn't an ending but a transition, a dangerous journey through the underworld, called the Duat, to reach the field of reeds, a paradise where the blessed dead would live eternally. This journey was fraught with dangers, supernatural threats, demons, and trials that the deceased soul would have to navigate. And in this perilous passage, cats played a protective role. The most direct mythological evidence comes from the Amduat, the book of what is in the underworld, and other funerary texts. These texts describe how the sun god Ra travels through the underworld each night, bringing light to the realm of the dead before being reborn at dawn. During this journey, Ra faces his greatest enemy, Apophis, the serpent of chaos who tries to swallow the sun and prevent the new day from dawning. In several versions of this myth, Ra takes the form of a great cat to battle Apophis. The papyrus of Hunefer, dating to about 1275 BCE, contains a famous vignette showing this scene. A massive cat, identified as Ra himself, sits beside the Persea tree of life. The cat wields a knife and uses it to decapitate the serpent Apophis, whose coiled body writhes beneath the tree. This image is powerful. The cat as cosmic protector, as the force that ensures order triumphs over chaos, as the guardian of life itself. But this wasn't just about the gods. The deceased, in their journey through the underworld, would follow Ra's path, and they needed protection from the same forces that threatened the sun god. Having a cat, either as a living presence honoured during life, or as a mummified companion placed in the tomb, created a connection to this divine protective power. The cat became a guardian spirit, a defender against the demons of the underworld. Archaeological evidence shows that cats were indeed placed in tombs. Not every burial included a cat. This was more common among those who could afford it, but examples have been found across different social classes. In some cases, a mummified cat was placed in the tomb along with the human mummy, positioned near the feet or in a corner. In other cases, cat statues or cat amulets were included, symbolic representations that carried the same protective power. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered largely intact in 1922, didn't contain a cat mummy, but did include several feline-related objects. There were statues of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess closely related to Bastet, and amulets with cat imagery. This shows that even in a royal burial, with all its elaborate preparation and massive wealth, the protective power of the feline divine was considered necessary. For non-royal individuals, the inclusion of cats in burials was more direct. At Abydos, a sacred site associated with Osiris, god of the dead, excavations have uncovered burials where humans and cats were interred together, sometimes in the same coffin. These weren't random placements. The care taken in mummifying and positioning the cats shows intentional ritual purpose. The cat was meant to accompany the deceased into the afterlife, to provide companionship and protection. What did the Egyptians believe happened to the cat's soul? Egyptian theology held that all living beings had a ba, a soul or personality, and a ka, a life force. When a cat died, especially one that had been loved and honoured, its ba could continue to exist in the afterlife. By mummifying the cat and placing it in a tomb or offering it at a temple, the living ensured that the cat's ba would be preserved and could fulfill its protective function eternally. Some tombs include inscriptions that explicitly mention the deceased's cat. These aren't just labels, they're declarations of affection and importance. The sarcophagus of Prince Thutmose's cat, Meow, which I mentioned earlier, is the most elaborate example, but simpler burials also sometimes include scratched or painted names, brief prayers asking for the cat's safe passage to the afterlife. Tomb paintings show cats in paradise, in scenes depicting the field of reeds. These images show the deceased enjoying an idealized afterlife, farming abundant land, feasting with family, and in some cases, their cat is present, sitting under a chair or nearby, just as it had in life. This visual evidence tells us that Egyptians imagined their cats would be with them in eternity, that the bond between human and cat didn't end with death. There's also the practice of offering cat mummies to Bastet at her temples. While these weren't buried with individual humans, they served a related purpose. By offering a mummified cat to the goddess, a worshipper created a permanent prayer that would continue in the afterlife. The cat spirit would join Bastet's divine retinue, and from there it could intercede on behalf of the person who had offered it, providing divine protection both in life and after death. The sheer scale of cat mummification, millions of cats over the course of Egyptian history, demonstrates how seriously this practice was taken. It wasn't a minor superstition. It was a central element of funerary religion, considered as important as many of the more famous aspects like pyramid building or Book of the Dead illustrations. Scientific analysis of cat mummies has revealed interesting details about the mummification process. While human mummification followed strict protocols, cat mummification was more variable. Some cat mummies show expert preparation, with the body carefully dried, organs removed, and wrapping done with precision. Others are more hastily prepared, wrapped tightly but without removing organs, relying on natron salts to preserve the exterior. This variation probably reflects differences in cost and the purpose of the mummy. A beloved family pet would receive more careful treatment than a temple-bred cat meant for mass offering. CT scanning has also revealed that not all cat mummies actually contain complete cats. Some contain only bones, a skull, and a few vertebrae wrapped to look like a complete cat. Some contain cat bones mixed with other materials, like sticks or mud, to create the right shape and weight. This might seem like fraud, but it probably wasn't viewed that way. What mattered in Egyptian religious thought was the ritual correctness and the intention. The wrapped form represented a cat, and that representation carried spiritual power even if the physical contents weren't perfect. There's something deeply touching about this entire practice. The ancient Egyptians, confronting death as all humans must, found comfort in the idea that their cats would be with them in the afterlife. They couldn't imagine eternity without the soft pad of paws, the comforting purr, the graceful presence of these animals they had lived with and loved. So they made sure, through mummification and ritual, through tomb paintings and amulets, through offerings and prayers, that cats would be eternal companions. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the quiet of an ancient tomb, sealed for thousands of years. In the darkness, a human mummy lies in its sarcophagus, surrounded by the objects meant to help in the afterlife: furniture, food, clothing, and nearby, a smaller bundle, carefully wrapped, containing a cat. In the Egyptian belief system, both souls have moved on to the field of reeds, where they exist in blessed eternity. The human tends to abundant fields under a perfect sky, and the cat, eternal and divine, sits nearby, keeping watch as it always has, a guardian, a companion, a connection to the divine. Time has no meaning here, only peace, only the eternal purr of contentment, only the bond between human and feline that not even death can break. Chapter 7. The Decline of Cat Worship. How a Sacred Tradition Ended. How did a religious practice so deeply embedded in Egyptian culture for thousands of years eventually come to an end? The decline of cat worship in Egypt is a gradual story spanning centuries, involving political change, religious transformation, and cultural evolution. And it leaves us with important lessons about how even the most sacred traditions can fade. The height of cat worship and the cult of Bastet was during Egypt's late period, roughly 664 to 332 BCE, and the subsequent Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers controlled Egypt. Ironically, cat worship may have actually intensified during these eras of foreign influence, as Egyptians clung more tightly to their traditional religious practices as a form of cultural identity. The mass production of cat mummies reached its peak during this time, with industrial-scale breeding and mummification operations at temples across Egypt. The Greek rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty, beginning with Ptolemy I in 323 BCE, after Alexander the Great's conquest, generally supported traditional Egyptian religion. They understood that maintaining the temples and honouring the gods was essential for political stability. They presented themselves as pharaohs, participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and funded temple construction and restoration. During this period, Bubastis continued to thrive, and the annual Festival of Bastet remained one of Egypt's major religious events. Greek and Egyptian cultures began to blend, creating what historians call Hellenistic Egyptian culture. Greek settlers in Egypt sometimes adopted Egyptian religious practices, including reverence for cats. Conversely, some Egyptian deities were merged with Greek gods in a process called syncretism. Bastet was occasionally identified with Artemis, the Greek goddess of hunting, though this connection was never as strong as some other divine syncretisms. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE, when Octavian defeated Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, marked the beginning of more significant changes. The Romans were generally tolerant of local religions in their empire, but they viewed Egyptian animal worship with puzzlement and sometimes contempt. Roman writers like Cicero and Juvenal wrote mockingly about Egyptians who worshipped cats, crocodiles, and ibises, seeing it as superstitious and barbaric compared to Roman religious sensibilities. Despite Roman attitudes, cat worship continued for several more centuries. The temples remained operational, priests continued their duties, and pilgrims still travelled to Bubastis for the Festival of Bastet. The industrial mummification of cats continued, though there's some evidence that the quality and care decreased over time, with more of the hastily prepared or partially filled mummies appearing in later periods. The real turning point came with the spread of Christianity. Egypt was one of the earliest regions to embrace Christianity, with tradition holding that the Gospel of Mark was written in Alexandria and that Mark himself established the Egyptian church. By the 2nd century CE, Christian communities were growing throughout Egypt, and by the 4th century, Christianity was becoming dominant. Christian theology was fundamentally incompatible with animal worship. The idea that divinity could be embodied in a cat, that an animal could be sacred in itself, contradicted Christian teaching about the unique relationship between God and humanity. Early Christian writers were particularly harsh in their condemnation of Egyptian animal cults, seeing them as prime examples of the pagan idolatry that Christianity had come to replace. In 325 CE, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, and in 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official state religion and began actively suppressing pagan practices. In Egypt, This meant the closure of temples, the persecution of traditional priests, and the destruction of religious sites that wouldn't convert to Christian use. The temple at Bubastis was among those closed. The exact date isn't certain, but by the late 4th or early 5th century, the annual festival had ended, the priests were dispersed, and the cat cemeteries stopped receiving new mummies. Some temples were converted into churches, their walls covered with Christian frescoes painted over ancient Egyptian reliefs. Others were simply abandoned and gradually fell into ruin as local populations stripped them of stones for building materials. The theological shift was dramatic. Cats went from being sacred to being, at best, ordinary animals and at worst, associated with paganism and even evil. Medieval Christian tradition would eventually associate cats, especially black cats, with witchcraft and Satan, a complete reversal of their ancient Egyptian status. This change took centuries and varied by region, but the foundation was laid in these early Christian centuries when animal worship was systematically suppressed. But the end of organized cat worship didn't mean the end of cats in Egypt, or the immediate erasure of all cultural memory. Ordinary Egyptians continued to keep cats for pest control, and some level of affection and respect for cats persisted in folk culture, even if the religious framework had disappeared. The practical value of cats in protecting grain stores didn't change just because the temples closed. The archaeological evidence shows this transition. Excavations at sites like Oxyrhynchus, a city in Middle Egypt, have revealed how Christian and traditional Egyptian culture coexisted for a period before Christianity became completely dominant. In the same areas where cat mummies were once offered, Christian papyri and artifacts appear, showing the gradual replacement of one religious system with another. The Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century brought another religious change, but Islam's relationship with cats was more positive than Christianity's had been. Islamic tradition holds that the Prophet Muhammad loved cats, and while cats weren't sacred in Islam, they were respected as clean animals, allowed in mosques, and generally treated well. In Islamic Egypt, cats remained common and valued, though the theological framework was entirely different from ancient Egyptian cat worship. By the medieval period, memory of the ancient practice had faded from living culture. Egyptians of the Islamic era knew that their ancestors had built the pyramids and temples, but the specific religious practices, including cat worship, were largely forgotten or misunderstood. The temples lay in ruins, buried under sand, their inscriptions unreadable because knowledge of hieroglyphics had been lost. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the rise of Egyptology as a scholarly discipline, that cat worship was rediscovered and understood. When researchers like Champollion deciphered hieroglyphics and excavators like Naville uncovered temples like Bubastis, the full extent of ancient Egyptian cat reverence became clear again. The discovery of massive cat cemeteries shocked the modern world, which had no cultural memory of this practice. Some of those excavated cat mummies ended up in museums, where they remain today, silent witnesses to a religious tradition that once commanded the devotion of millions, but had been completely forgotten for over 1,000 years. Looking at a cat mummy in a museum case, you're seeing an artifact from a worldview so different from our own that it's hard to fully comprehend. A world where the cat sleeping by your hearth wasn't just a pet, but a manifestation of divine power, where honouring cats was a sacred duty, where the boundary between the animal and the divine was permeable. The decline of cat worship reminds us that even the most deeply embedded cultural practices can end, that religions that seem eternal are subject to historical forces, that what one era considers sacred, another might forget entirely. But it also shows the resilience of certain relationships. While the worship of Bastet ended, the bond between humans and cats survived every religious and political change, every conquest and cultural shift. Cats remained in Egyptian homes through the Christian period, through Islamic rule, right up to the present day, valued and loved even without the theological framework that once made them divine. Chapter 8. The Legacy of Bastet. How Ancient Egypt's Cats Changed the World. What lasting impact did ancient Egyptian cat worship have on the world, and how does it continue to influence our relationship with cats today? The legacy of Bastet and the sacred cats of Egypt extends far beyond the end of ancient Egyptian civilization, shaping cat domestication, cultural attitudes, and even modern spiritual practices in ways that might surprise you. Let's start with the most fundamental legacy, the domestic cat itself. Genetic studies have confirmed that all domestic cats today descend primarily from Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat that ancient Egyptians first began living alongside around 4000 BCE. While cat domestication may have begun independently in other regions, Egyptian cats were the most thoroughly integrated into human society, and Egyptian breeding practices shaped the domestic cat population. When Egypt became part of larger empires, first under the Greeks and then the Romans, cats spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Egyptian cats were traded, sometimes illegally, since Egypt had laws restricting their export, and they established populations in Greece, Rome, and eventually throughout Europe and Asia. The modern domestic cat is, in a very real sense, a descendant of the cats that once walked through the temples of Bubastis and sat beneath the chairs of Egyptian nobility. The Egyptian practice of selective breeding also influenced the development of cat breeds. While the ancient Egyptians didn't create distinct breeds in the modern sense, they selected for traits like docility, size, and coat colour. The Abyssinian cat breed, though its direct connection to ancient Egypt is debated, is often cited as resembling the cats shown in ancient Egyptian art. The sleek, elegant build and tawny coat of Abyssinians do match the appearance of cats in tomb paintings and sculptures. Beyond genetics, Egyptian cat worship influenced cultural attitudes toward cats that persist in various forms today. The idea that cats possess a special dignity, an almost supernatural awareness, echoes the ancient Egyptian belief that cats carried divine essence. When we say a cat acts like it owns the place, or when we marvel at a cat's mysterious, independent nature, we are unconsciously echoing ideas that were explicitly theological in ancient Egypt. The protection of cats in law also has ancient Egyptian roots. While modern animal welfare laws have different philosophical foundations, the concept that harming a cat is a serious offence has precedent in ancient Egyptian law. The reverence for cats in ancient Egypt set a standard for how valuable these animals could be to a society, even if modern protections are based on preventing cruelty rather than religious sanctity. In art and iconography, the legacy is clear. The image of the cat-headed goddess Bastet has become iconic, instantly recognizable even to people with no deep knowledge of Egyptian history. Bastet statues are among the most popular ancient Egyptian artifacts in museums, and reproductions are widely sold as decorative items, often with little understanding of their original religious significance. The aesthetic of the Egyptian cat, sleek, elegant, often adorned with jewellery, has influenced how cats are depicted in art across cultures. Modern spiritual movements have also embraced Bastet and Egyptian cat symbolism. Neo-pagan religions, Wiccan traditions, and various New Age practices often incorporate Bastet as a goddess of feminine power, protection, and independence. While these modern interpretations differ significantly from ancient Egyptian theology, they represent a continuity of finding spiritual significance in the figure of the cat goddess. Bastet has been adapted to fit contemporary spiritual needs, much as ancient Egyptians adapted her image from lioness to cat over the centuries. The archaeological study of Egyptian cat worship has also contributed to broader understanding of human-animal relationships. Egyptology and zooarchaeology, the study of animal remains at archaeological sites, have used Egyptian cat evidence to explore questions about domestication, ritual behaviour, and the role of animals in religion. The extensive records and remains from Egypt provide an unparalleled dataset for understanding how and why humans form bonds with animals. There's also an educational legacy. For many people, learning about ancient Egyptian cat worship is their first introduction to how different cultures can view animals in ways that challenge modern assumptions. It opens discussions about cultural relativism, about how religion shapes behavior, and about the deep history of human-cat relationships. Teachers use the story of Bastet to engage students with ancient history, archaeology, and anthropology. The influence even extends to popular culture. Cats in fiction are often portrayed with Egyptian associations. The musical Cats by Andrew Lloyd Webber, while not directly about Egyptian religion, includes characters and imagery that evoke ancient Egypt. Films, books, and video games regularly use Egyptian cat imagery, drawing on the cultural memory of cats as mysterious, powerful, and connected to ancient wisdom. There's also been a tourism legacy. Egypt's cat history attracts visitors interested in more than just pyramids and pharaohs. Sites like Bubastis, though largely ruined, still draw tourists interested in the history of cat worship. Museum exhibitions featuring cat mummies and Bastet statues are consistently popular, bringing awareness of ancient Egyptian culture to broad audiences. Perhaps most significantly, the Egyptian view of cats as worthy of honour, as creatures deserving respect and care, has contributed to the modern conception of cats as companion animals rather than merely utilitarian pest controllers. While cats still serve practical purposes on farms and in some homes, the primary relationship most people have with cats today is as companions, family members, creatures valued for their own sake. This echoes the ancient Egyptian practice of keeping cats both for their practical skills and for the joy and spiritual significance of their presence. The mummification practices, though no longer followed, left a legacy in the form of millions of preserved specimens that scientists continue to study. Modern techniques like DNA analysis, CT scanning, and isotope testing allow researchers to extract information from these mummies that the ancient embalmers never imagined. Each cat mummy is a time capsule, containing information about ancient cat populations, diseases, diet, human-animal relationships, and religious practices. The scientific legacy of Egyptian cat worship continues to grow as new analytical techniques are developed. There's also a cautionary legacy. The industrial scale of cat mummification, particularly in later periods when quality declined and practices became more about commerce than genuine devotion, serves as a historical example of how religious practice can be commodified and how good intentions can lead to problematic outcomes. Modern archaeologists and ethicists studying this practice reflect on the tension between religious devotion and animal welfare, a discussion that remains relevant in contemporary debates about animal rights and religious freedom. As you settle into sleep, consider the thread that connects us across millennia to those ancient Egyptians who first looked at wildcats and saw something worthy of reverence. The cat purring beside you, if you're lucky enough to have one, is part of a story that stretches back thousands of years. A story of mutual benefit evolving into companionship, of practical partnership becoming spiritual connection. When your cat looks at you with those enigmatic eyes, there's an echo of Bastet in that gaze, a reminder that these creatures once walked as gods among humans, and perhaps, in their own minds, they still do. The ancient Egyptians understood something profound about cats, that in their grace and independence, in their capacity for both fierce protection and gentle affection, in their mysterious awareness and their connection to both light and darkness, cats reflect something essential about the nature of existence itself. They saw the divine in the domestic, the cosmic in the common, the eternal in the everyday presence of these remarkable animals. This is the ultimate legacy of Bastet and the sacred cats of ancient Egypt. not the temples now in ruins or the mummies in museum cases, but the living relationship between humans and cats that continues in homes around the world. Every time someone adopts a cat, provides it with care and affection, respects its independence while offering companionship, they're participating in a bond that began on the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago. The temples may have fallen, the goddess may no longer receive offerings, but the cats remain, still mysterious, still dignified, still capable of making humans feel blessed by their presence. And in that continuity, in that unbroken thread of relationship despite the rise and fall of empires, the transformation of religions, and the passage of countless generations, there is something sacred after all, something that transcends any particular theology or cultural practice. It's the simple recognition that some bonds between species go beyond utility or reason, entering the realm of meaning, of connection, of a shared journey through the mystery of existence. As you drift off to sleep tonight, wherever you are in the world, whether a cat is near you or not, you're connected to this ancient story. You're part of the legacy of those first humans who invited wildcats into their grain stores and found they'd invited in something magical. You're heir to the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians who looked at cats and saw not just animals but teachers, protectors, manifestations of divine grace. And perhaps, in your dreams, you'll walk along the Nile as it was thousands of years ago, when the temples gleamed in the sun, when the air rang with sistrums, when cats walked proudly through streets and palaces, knowing they were beloved, knowing they were sacred, knowing they were exactly what they've always been and will always be, extraordinary beings who chose to share their lives with us, and in doing so, changed us forever. Sleep well, and may Bastet watch over your dreams, bringing protection, peace, and perhaps the comforting sound of purring from across the ages, a sound that speaks of contentment, of safety, of the eternal bond between humans and the cats who allowed us into their world and made it ours together. Chapter 9. The Temples and Priests. Daily Life, Serving the Cat Goddess. What was it like to be a priest of Bastet, dedicating your entire life to serving the cat goddess? And what daily rituals did these ancient temples perform? The answer takes us deep into the religious infrastructure of ancient Egypt, revealing a complex system of worship that sustained thousands of people and shaped entire cities around the reverence for feline divinity. The priesthood of Bastet was a formal, structured institution with hierarchies, responsibilities, and privileges that made it one of the most desirable religious positions in ancient Egypt. At the top was the high priest of Bastet, called the greatest of seers, or the greatest of the 5 of the house of Bastet. This position was often held by men from influential families, sometimes even members of the royal family or nobility. The high priest was responsible for the overall administration of the temple, for performing the most sacred rituals, and for managing the vast estates that supported the temple's operations. Below the high priest were various ranks of priests, each with specific duties. The Wab priests, whose name means pure ones, were responsible for the daily care of the goddess's statue and the temple's sacred spaces. They had to maintain strict purity standards, bathing multiple times a day in the sacred pool, shaving all body hair, wearing only clean linen garments, and abstaining from certain foods. This ritual purity was essential because they would come into direct contact with the divine presence embodied in the statue of Bastet. There were also the lector priests, called Keri Heb, who were responsible for reading the sacred texts during rituals. These men had to be literate, a relatively rare skill in ancient Egypt, and they needed to know the proper pronunciation and intonation of the sacred words. The power of the rituals depended on performing them exactly correctly, with the right words spoken at the right times, accompanied by the right gestures and offerings. The temple also employed specialist priests who cared for the sacred cats that lived within the temple precincts. These cats were considered the living embodiments of the goddess, and caring for them was a sacred duty. Archaeological evidence suggests that large temples like the one at Bubastis housed dozens or even hundreds of cats at any given time. These cats needed to be fed, their living spaces cleaned, and their health monitored. Priests who specialized in this work would have spent their days ensuring these divine animals were comfortable and well cared for. The daily routine in the Temple of Bastet followed a pattern that was consistent across Egyptian temples, modified for the specific deity being served. The day began before dawn with the morning ritual called the opening of the doors. A procession of priests would approach the sanctuary where the statue of Bastet resided. The high priest, or a designated representative, would break the clay seal on the sanctuary doors, seals that had been placed the previous evening to protect the goddess during the night. As the doors opened, hymns would be sung, praising Bastet as the sun rose. The goddess was believed to awaken with the dawn, just as the sun god Ra emerged from the underworld after his nightly battle with chaos. The priests would enter the sanctuary and approach the statue. In the dim light filtering through high windows, the golden or gilded statue would begin to glow, creating an effect that must have seemed truly divine. The statue would then be ritually cleansed. Priests would wipe it with clean linen cloths, anoint it with sacred oils, and dress it in fresh linen garments. This wasn't just symbolic maintenance. It was believed that the goddess inhabited the statue, and caring for the statue was caring for the goddess herself. The oils used were expensive and precious, imported from distant lands, including frankincense and myrrh, cedar oil, and specially prepared perfumed unguents that were part of Bastet's traditional associations with ointments and sweet smells. After the cleansing and dressing, offerings would be presented. Tables laden with food were brought before the statue: bread, beer, roasted meat, fruits, vegetables, wine, and milk. These offerings weren't symbolic. They were actual meals, prepared in the temple kitchens by specialized cooks. The goddess was believed to consume the spiritual essence of the food, after which the physical food could be distributed to the priests as their payment. This system allowed the temple to support a large staff. The offerings to the gods became the practical sustenance for those who served them. Throughout the day, additional rituals marked the passage of time. At noon, there would be another ceremony, acknowledging the sun at its zenith and Bastet's connection to solar power. In the evening, as the sun set, there would be a final ritual, the closing of the doors, where the statue would be sealed back into the sanctuary for the night, protected from any malevolent forces that might threaten during the dark hours. But the temple's activities went far beyond these core rituals. The temple at Bubastis was an economic powerhouse. It owned vast agricultural estates, fields that stretched for miles along the Nile, worked by farmers who owed labour service to the temple. The grain, flax, vegetables, and other produce from these fields supported the temple's population and provided surplus that could be traded or sold. The temple also owned workshops where artisans produced goods, weavers made linen, potters created vessels, metal workers crafted bronze statues and ritual implements, all under the temple's authority. Administrative priests managed this economic empire. They kept detailed records on papyrus scrolls, tracking income and expenses, recording the distribution of rations to workers, documenting legal disputes, and managing the temple's interactions with the royal government. Excavations at temple sites have recovered thousands of these administrative documents, giving us detailed insights into how the system worked. We know, for example, that temples employed guards, gardeners, bakers, brewers, launders, and countless other specialized workers, all part of the religious economic complex. The temple also served social functions beyond pure worship. It was a center of learning, where young men could train to become scribes and priests. It was a place of healing, where priest physicians would treat the sick. combining medical knowledge with religious ritual. Bastet herself was sometimes invoked in healing, particularly for ailments affecting women and children, and the temple would have had facilities where the sick could come to seek the goddess's intervention. The catteries, where cats were bred for mummification, were a significant part of the temple complex. Archaeological excavations at Saqqara and other sites have uncovered large structures that appear to have been dedicated to housing and breeding cats. These weren't cruel factory farms in the modern sense, but they were industrial in scale. Cats were kept in rooms or enclosures, fed regularly, and allowed to breed. When cats reached the appropriate age, or when demand required it, they would be humanely killed, typically by a quick breaking of the neck, and then turned over to the embalmers. The embalming workshops were separate areas within the temple precincts. Here, specialized priests called tarishutes, embalmers, would prepare the cat bodies for mummification. The process varied based on the price point. Expensive mummifications involved removing organs through small incisions, thorough drying with natron, careful wrapping with resin-soaked linen, and placement in decorated containers. Cheaper versions might simply involve wrapping the intact body tightly and treating it with natron externally. The embalmers had to work quickly, particularly during festival times when demand for cat mummies would spike as pilgrims sought offerings for the goddess. Life as a priest of Bastet carried significant social prestige. Priests were literate, educated, and had access to resources that most Egyptians didn't. They were exempt from certain taxes and labor obligations. However, it also required genuine commitment. The purity requirements were demanding. The rituals had to be performed consistently regardless of personal circumstances, and priests were expected to maintain the dignity and reputation of their position at all times. There were also female religious roles associated with Bastet. Women could serve as singers and musicians in the temple, performing during rituals and festivals. These weren't minor positions. Skilled musicians were highly valued, and their performances were considered essential to properly honouring the goddess. Women musicians would play sistrums, harps, and other instruments, and they would sing hymns composed specifically for Bastet. Some women also served as priestesses, though their exact roles and how they compared to male priests is still debated by scholars due to limited evidence. The relationship between the temple and the surrounding city was symbiotic. The temple provided employment, purchased goods from local merchants and craftspeople, and created demand that sustained entire industries. The city benefited from the pilgrims who came to worship, filling inns, buying food and souvenirs, supporting a vibrant economy. During the annual festival, this relationship intensified, with the city's entire economy revolving around serving the hundreds of thousands of visitors who came to honour Bastet. The priests also had political influence. The high priest of Bastet would have been a significant figure in regional politics, consulted by governors and sometimes even by the pharaoh. The temple's wealth and the loyalty it commanded from thousands of workers and worshippers made it a power centre that couldn't be ignored. Throughout Egyptian history, there was always a delicate balance between royal authority and priestly power, and the major temples like Bubastis were key players in that dynamic. As you let your mind wander through these ancient temple halls, imagine the sensory experience. The smell of incense burning constantly, thick clouds of frankincense and myrrh smoke filling the air, the sound of sistrums rattling during rituals, of priests chanting in the ancient Egyptian language, of cats meowing and purring in their sacred housing, the sight of golden statues gleaming in lamplight, of walls covered in brightly painted hieroglyphs and images of the goddess, of priests in pristine white linen moving in choreographed ritual patterns, the feel of cool stone floors underfoot, polished smooth by thousands of sandaled feet over centuries, and always the presence of cats lounging in sunny courtyards, cats being carried reverently by priests, cats watching the rituals with those enigmatic eyes. cats that were fed the finest fish and meats, that slept on cushions, that were honoured and adored. To serve in the temple of Bastet was to live in a world where the boundary between human and divine, between animal and spiritual, was acknowledged and celebrated every single day. Chapter 10. Cat Medicine and Magic, Healing Powers and Protective Spells. Did ancient Egyptians believe cats possessed healing powers, and what magical properties did they attribute to these sacred animals? The intersection of medicine, magic, and cats in ancient Egypt reveals a sophisticated system of belief where practical knowledge and spiritual understanding were inseparably intertwined. In ancient Egyptian thought, there was no clear distinction between medicine and magic. Illness was understood as having both physical and supernatural causes, and effective treatment required addressing both aspects. Cats, as sacred animals connected to Bastet, were believed to possess inherent protective and healing properties that could be harnessed through various practices. The ancient Egyptians observed that households with cats tended to be healthier, and they were right, though not for the spiritual reasons they believed. Cats controlled rodent populations, and rodents were vectors for disease, including plague and other infections. Fewer rodents meant fewer disease outbreaks, so the presence of a cat genuinely did contribute to household health. But the Egyptians interpreted this as proof of the cat's divine protective power. Bastet was guarding the home against illness through her feline representatives. Medical papyri from ancient Egypt occasionally mention cats in healing contexts. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most comprehensive medical texts surviving from ancient Egypt, dating to around 1550 BCE, includes remedies that invoke Bastet's protection. While the papyrus focuses primarily on herbal remedies and surgical techniques, showing that Egyptians had genuine medical knowledge, it also includes magical spells to be recited while administering treatment, and some of these call upon Bastet to grant healing. One particular area where Bastet was frequently invoked was in protecting women during pregnancy and childbirth. Childbirth in the ancient world was extremely dangerous, with high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. Bastet, as a mother goddess often depicted with kittens, was seen as a natural protector of mothers. Pregnant women would wear amulets showing Bastet with kittens, symbolically placing themselves under the goddess's protection. They would pray to Bastet for a safe delivery, sometimes making offerings at her temples or at household shrines. The evidence for this practice is substantial. Archaeological excavations of homes have uncovered numerous Bastet amulets in domestic contexts, particularly in areas associated with women's activities. Tombs of women who died in childbirth sometimes contain Bastet imagery, suggesting that even in death, the bereaved family sought the goddess's protection for the deceased woman's journey to the afterlife. There were also specific magical spells involving cats or invoking Bastet that were used for protection against evil. The ancient Egyptians believed in various malevolent supernatural entities, demons, ghosts, and the evil eye, that could cause illness, bad luck, or death. Protective magic was a routine part of daily life, and cats played a significant role in this. One class of protective spells involved drawing images of cats, sometimes with knives, threatening potential evil spirits. These drawings might be made on papyrus and worn as amulets, or painted on walls, particularly near doorways or windows where harmful entities might enter. The cat, with its fierce hunting instincts and its connection to the sun god's battle against chaos, was seen as a powerful deterrent against supernatural threats. Cat whiskers were sometimes collected and used in protective charms. The Egyptians had noticed that a cat's whiskers are sensitive and help it navigate in darkness and detect threats, so whiskers became associated with awareness and protection. A whisker from a temple cat might be especially valued, believed to carry the goddess's blessing. These would be carefully preserved in small containers or sewn into clothing as protective talismans. Even cat fur had magical associations. The Turin magical papyrus, dating to the Ramesside period, around 1200 BCE, mentions using cat fur in certain rituals. The specific details of these rituals are sometimes cryptic, written in a way that assumes the reader already has knowledge of magical practices, but it's clear that various parts of cats, collected from naturally shed fur rather than by harming living cats, were valued in magical workings. The connection between cats and the sun also had medical implications. Some Egyptian medical theory held that diseases could be caused by supernatural darkness or shadow entering the body. The cat, with its solar associations and its glowing eyes that seemed to contain light, was seen as capable of driving out this darkness. Rituals might involve a sick person sleeping near a cat, believing that the cat's divine solar essence would purge the illness. There's also evidence that cats themselves were believed to receive healing at temples. The practice of incubation, where sick people would sleep in temple precincts hoping to receive healing dreams or direct divine intervention, was common in Egyptian religion. It appears that sick cats belonging to wealthy owners might be brought to temples of Bastet for similar healing. Votive offerings found at temples include small statues showing cats that appear injured or ill, possibly offerings of thanks for a cat's recovery or prayers for healing. The protective power of cat amulets extended beyond health to general safety and fortune. Soldiers might carry small Bastet amulets into battle, seeking the goddess's fierce protective aspect. Merchants travelling on dangerous trade routes might wear cat amulets to ward off bandits and bad luck. Farmers might place Bastet images in their fields, asking for protection of crops from pests and for fertility of the land. The magical texts also reveal that cats were associated with revealing truth and hidden knowledge. The cat's ability to see in the dark was interpreted as a capacity to perceive what is hidden, to detect deception and reveal secrets. Some divination practices involved observing cats' behavior. A cat's refusal to enter a house might be interpreted as a warning of danger within, while a cat choosing to stay in a home was a sign of blessing and good fortune. One particularly fascinating aspect is the use of cat imagery in protective magic for children. Children in ancient Egypt faced high mortality rates from disease, accidents, and other dangers. Parents used every available means to protect them, and Bastet featured prominently in these efforts. Small amulets showing Bastet or cats would be hung around children's necks. Spells invoking Bastet's protection were recited over newborns. Lullabies might mention the goddess watching over the sleeping child. There's a beautiful protective spell preserved in the magical papyrus of Brooklyn, dating to the late period, that invokes Bastet to guard a child through the night. The spell describes the goddess as a fierce lioness who will devour any demon or evil spirit that approaches the sleeping child, but also as a gentle mother cat who will purr and keep the child peaceful. This dual nature, protective ferocity combined with nurturing gentleness, made Bastet a perfect guardian for vulnerable children. The practice of placing cat statues in homes also had a magical protective dimension. These statues weren't just decorative or devotional, they were believed to actively guard the house. A cat statue near the doorway would prevent evil from entering. A cat statue in the bedroom would ensure peaceful sleep free from nightmares. A cat statue in the area where food was stored would protect not just against physical rodents but against spiritual contamination of the food supply. Some magical practices involved more elaborate rituals. A text from the late period describes a ritual for protecting a house that involves walking around the perimeter with a cat, allowing the cat to mark the boundary with its presence and scent. While the cat likely had no idea it was participating in a magical ritual, the human participants believed that the cat's divine essence was creating a protective barrier around the property. The eyes of cats had special magical significance. The way cat eyes seemed to glow in low light, reflecting even small amounts of illumination, fascinated the Egyptians. They interpreted this as evidence that cats contained solar fire within them, that they carried light into darkness. The Eye of Ra symbol, a powerful protective amulet in Egyptian magic, was sometimes depicted with feline characteristics, merging the solar eye with the cat's luminous gaze. Archaeological evidence supports the widespread use of cat-related magic across all social classes. Expensive bronze Bastet statues in wealthy tombs, crude terracotta cat figurines in poor graves, cat amulets made of valuable gold and cheap faience, all indicate that regardless of economic status, Egyptians sought the protective power of feline magic. There were also negative magical associations. While cats were generally seen as protective and beneficial, there was acknowledgement that their power could be dangerous if not properly respected. Harming a cat wasn't just legally problematic, it was magically dangerous, bringing down the wrath of Bastet upon the offender. This belief likely reinforced the legal protections, making people genuinely afraid to mistreat cats, not just from fear of human punishment, but from fear of supernatural retribution. Some magical texts warn against angering cats, suggesting that a cat's curse could bring misfortune. While this might seem superstitious to modern minds, consider the psychological reality. In a culture that believed absolutely in the divine power of cats, being hissed at or scratched by a cat could genuinely cause anxiety and stress, potentially leading to psychosomatic symptoms that would confirm the belief in the cat's power to curse. The medical and magical use of cats and cat imagery also extended into dream interpretation. Dream books, texts that explained the meanings of various dream symbols, included cats. Dreaming of a healthy, happy cat was generally interpreted as positive, indicating divine favor and upcoming good fortune. Dreaming of an angry or injured cat might be interpreted as a warning, suggesting that the dreamer had somehow offended Bastet or neglected their spiritual duties. As you relax into sleep, imagine being an ancient Egyptian child, falling asleep with a small Bastet amulet around your neck, feeling its weight as a comforting presence. Your parents have recited a protective spell over you, asking the goddess to guard your dreams. In the corner of the room, the household cat lies curled up, its gentle breathing and occasional purr a soothing backdrop. You've been taught that this cat is sacred, that it carries divine protection, that its very presence keeps you safe from all harm, and in that belief there is genuine comfort, a sense of being watched over by forces greater than yourself, a connection to the divine mediated through the soft fur and glowing eyes of the purring guardian sharing your home. Chapter 11. Royal Cats, Felines in the Courts of Pharaohs. How did cats fit into the lives of Egypt's royal family, and what evidence do we have of Pharaoh's relationships with these sacred animals? The connection between Egyptian royalty and cats reveals that the highest levels of power in ancient Egypt were just as enchanted by felines as common people were, and sometimes even more so. The archaeological record provides clear evidence that pharaohs and their families kept cats as both companions and symbols of their divine authority. The most famous example is the cat of Prince Thutmose, son of Amenhotep III, from around 1400 BCE. Prince Thutmose was crown prince, heir to the throne, and likely the eldest son of one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. He served as a high priest and was clearly a man of significant status. Yet when his beloved cat Tamiu died, he commissioned a limestone sarcophagus for her, had her name inscribed in formal hieroglyphs, and referred to her as the Osiris, granting her the same afterlife status as a human. This sarcophagus, now in the Cairo Museum, is extraordinary in its implications. The craftsmanship is excellent, the limestone carefully carved and smoothed. The inscription is formal and respectful, using the same grammatical forms that would be used for a noble person. This wasn't a casual pet burial. It was a formal interment with all the dignity usually reserved for humans. The sarcophagus tells us that at least some members of the royal family felt genuine love for their cats, emotion strong enough to warrant significant expense and effort. Unfortunately, Prince Thutmose died before he could become pharaoh. His younger brother would eventually reign as Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, the revolutionary pharaoh who temporarily transformed Egyptian religion. But Ptahmew's sarcophagus survived, a testament to the prince's affection and to the honoured place cats could hold even in royal households. Royal imagery also included cats in significant ways. Tomb paintings from royal and noble tombs frequently show cats in domestic scenes, sitting under chairs during banquets or near the feet of the deceased. These aren't random decorative elements. In Egyptian funerary art, every detail had meaning. The presence of a cat in these scenes indicated that the deceased had lived a life blessed by Bastet, that they had honoured the goddess properly, and that they would have feline companionship in the afterlife. Some pharaohs are depicted in the company of cats in more symbolic ways. The famous painted chest from Tutankhamun's tomb shows the young pharaoh hunting, and while the main focus is on him shooting arrows from his chariot, there's a cat depicted hunting beneath the chariot. This image connects the pharaoh's royal power, expressed through hunting, with the cat's natural hunting prowess, both operating under divine sanction. The cat legitimizes the pharaoh's authority by associating him with Bastet's fierce, protective power. Pharaohs were also major patrons of Bastet's temples. Royal inscriptions record donations of land, gold, and resources to the temple at Bubastis and other sites where Bastet was worshipped. Ramesses II, one of Egypt's longest reigning and most powerful pharaohs, built extensively at Bubastis, adding to the temple complex and leaving his cartouche on monuments there. This wasn't just personal devotion, it was political strategy. Supporting popular cults like Bastet's worship was a way to demonstrate that the pharaoh honoured the gods, beloved by the people, reinforcing the connection between divine power and royal authority. Queens and royal women also had special connections to Bastet. The goddess's associations with femininity, motherhood, and protection made her particularly relevant to royal women who needed divine assistance during the dangerous process of childbirth. Royal wives and mothers would make offerings to Bastet, seeking the goddess's blessing for fertility and safe delivery. Some queens included Bastet imagery in their personal jewellery and amulets, wearing the goddess's protection literally close to their hearts. The presence of cats in the royal court also had practical dimensions. The royal palace complexes, like any large buildings, needed protection from rodents that would threaten food stores and damage valuable items. Cats serving this function in the palace weren't just working animals. They were sacred beings performing a divine duty in the service of the pharaoh. There's evidence that palace cats were particularly well cared for, with designated attendants responsible for their feeding and care. Archaeological excavations at palace sites have uncovered cat bones in contexts, suggesting they lived and died within royal precincts. Chemical analysis of these bones shows diets that included fish and high-quality meat, confirming that these cats were fed better than average. Some skeletal remains show evidence of medical care, broken bones that healed, suggesting that injured palace cats received treatment rather than being disposed of. The ideological connection between pharaohs and cats went deeper than just appreciation for useful or beloved animals. Pharaohs were understood to be divine themselves, living gods who maintained Maat, the cosmic order, on behalf of all Egypt. Cats, particularly through Bastet's connection to Ra's battle against chaos, were also agents of cosmic order. Both pharaohs and cats fought against Isfet, chaos and disorder. This theological parallel meant that honouring cats was, in a sense, honouring the same divine principles that legitimized pharaonic rule. There are also texts that describe cats in military contexts, not actual cats in battle, but cat imagery and symbolism used to inspire warriors. The leonine aspect of Bastet, her fierce protective rage when defending what she loves, was invoked to inspire Egyptian soldiers. Amulets showing Bastet in her lioness form were carried into battle. The pharaoh himself was sometimes described in military texts as a lion or as being under the protection of leonine goddesses, including Bastet. Royal jubilees and celebrations also featured Bastet prominently. The Sed Festival, a ritual renewal of the pharaoh's power, typically celebrated after 30 years of rule and then periodically thereafter, involved offerings to many gods, and Bastet always received her due. These festivals were massive state occasions, and the presence of Bastet in the ritual program shows her importance in the pantheon of gods who supported royal power. One particularly interesting piece of evidence comes from the late period, when Egypt was often under foreign rule. During these times of foreign domination, Egyptian cultural identity became more precious, and traditional practices were emphasized as acts of resistance and cultural preservation. Pharaohs of foreign origin, particularly during the Persian and Ptolemaic periods, made special efforts to present themselves as properly Egyptian, and one way they did this was through ostentatious support of popular Egyptian cults like Bastet's worship. The Ptolemaic rulers, Greek Macedonians by origin, were particularly invested in legitimizing their rule through Egyptian religion. Cleopatra VII, the famous last pharaoh of Egypt, would have participated in festivals honoring Bastet as part of her identity as an Egyptian ruler. While we don't have specific records of Cleopatra's personal cats, the royal palace at Alexandria certainly would have had cats, both for practical rodent control and as living symbols of the divine power that the queen claimed. There's also an interesting economic angle to royal cat ownership. The finest cat breeding, producing cats with desirable traits like particularly sleek coats or distinctive markings, likely occurred in royal and temple contexts where resources were available for selective breeding. Royal cats might have been gifted to favoured courtiers or foreign dignitaries as valuable presents, spreading Egyptian cat populations and Egyptian cultural influence simultaneously. Diplomatic gifts from Egyptian pharaohs to foreign rulers sometimes included luxury items, gold, fine linen, precious stones, and there's evidence that exotic animals were also sometimes gifted. While we don't have definitive proof of cats being diplomatic gifts, given their sacred status and their value, it's entirely plausible that Egyptian cats might have been presented to foreign courts, where they would serve as ambassadors of Egyptian culture and religion. The royal family's relationship with cats also influenced fashion and artistic trends. If the palace favoured certain types of cat imagery or particular ways of depicting Bastet, these preferences would filter down through society as people emulated royal taste. The styles of cat amulets and statues changed over time, and some of these changes likely reflect evolving royal preferences that set trends for the entire culture. As you let yourself drift deeper into relaxation, picture the royal palace at Thebes during the New Kingdom. In the private quarters of the Queen, away from the formal throne rooms and state chambers, there's a more intimate space. The walls are painted with beautiful scenes of gardens and wildlife. Expensive furniture, chairs, and beds inlaid with gold and ivory fills the room. And there, lounging on a cushion of fine linen, is a cat. Perhaps it's the Queen's personal companion, a cat she's loved since it was a kitten. Perhaps it's a new litter being raised in the palace, kittens tumbling over each other in play. The Queen watches them with genuine affection, and when she reaches down to stroke the cat's soft fur, there's no difference in that gesture from what any person, in any time, feels when connecting with a beloved animal. Power and divinity and politics fade away, leaving just the simple, timeless bond between human and cat, the quiet purr, the warm fur, the moment of peace in a life filled with the weight of empire. Chapter 12. When Egypt's cats went to war, felines in military history. Could a cat have changed the course of a battle? And did ancient enemies ever weaponize Egypt's love of cats against them? The answers reveal some of the most surprising and strategic uses of Egypt's cat reverence in the ancient world, where cultural beliefs became tactical vulnerabilities and religious devotion could mean military defeat. The most famous story of cats in Egyptian warfare comes from the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE, one of the most consequential battles in ancient Egyptian history. The Persian Empire, under King Cambyses II, was expanding westward and had set its sights on conquering Egypt. The Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik III assembled his forces to defend the eastern frontier at Pelusium, a fortress city in the Nile Delta that guarded the main invasion route into Egypt. According to the account by the ancient historian Polyaenus, written centuries after the battle, Cambyses employed a cunning and psychologically devastating tactic. He knew of the Egyptians' reverence for cats and other sacred animals, and he weaponized this knowledge. Polyaenus claims that Cambyses ordered his soldiers to paint images of Bastet on their shields, and some versions of the story go even further, suggesting that the Persian forces drove live cats, dogs, ibises, and other sacred animals before their advancing army, or even held cats as living shields. The Egyptians, according to this account, were paralyzed by religious horror. They couldn't shoot arrows or throw spears without risking harm to the sacred animals, either the live ones being driven toward them, or even the images of Bastet painted on enemy shields. Their fear of divine retribution for harming cats was so great that they couldn't effectively defend themselves. The battle was a decisive Persian victory. Psamtik III was defeated. Egypt fell under Persian control, and an independent Egyptian dynasty wouldn't rule the country again for over a century. How much of this story is true? Historians debate this extensively. Polyaenus wrote his stratagems in war several hundred years after the Battle of Pelusium, and he was collecting clever military tactics from throughout history, not writing strictly accurate historical accounts. Some scholars think the story is entirely legendary, created to illustrate Egyptian religious devotion or Persian cunning. Others think there may be a kernel of truth. Perhaps Persians did use some form of sacred animal imagery, even if not in the dramatic way the story describes. What makes the story plausible, whether or not it happened exactly as described, is that it aligns with what we know about Egyptian beliefs. The Egyptians genuinely did believe that harming cats brought down divine punishment. The legal and social consequences of killing a cat were severe enough that the threat of accidentally harming sacred animals could realistically affect military decision-making, especially in a culture where soldiers believed that divine favour was essential for victory. There's also archaeological evidence from the battle site. Excavations at Pelusium have uncovered mass graves containing hundreds of bodies from this period, confirming that a major battle did occur. Among the remains are cat bones, which some researchers have interpreted as possible evidence for the Polyaenus account. However, cat bones at an Egyptian site aren't unusual given how common cats were, so this evidence is far from conclusive. Whether or not cats directly influenced the Battle of Pelusium, the broader point remains valid. Egypt's cultural and religious practices could be exploited by enemies who understood them. The Persians, as successful empire builders, were skilled at understanding and manipulating the cultures they encountered. Using Egyptian religious beliefs against them would have been entirely consistent with Persian military strategy. Beyond this famous battle, there are other connections between cats and Egyptian military culture. Egyptian soldiers often carried amulets of Bastet, particularly in her fierce lioness form, seeking her protection in battle. The goddess who protected homes and children was also invoked to protect warriors in the field. Military units might have had mascot cats, animals that travelled with the troops and were believed to bring good luck and divine favour. The connection between leonine goddesses, including Bastet in her fiercer aspect, and royal military power was explicit in Egyptian ideology. Pharaohs were frequently compared to lions in military contexts, described as roaring against their enemies, pouncing on them with leonine ferocity, tearing them apart with divine strength. Bastet, Sekhmet, and other cat goddesses were part of this symbolic framework that linked feline power with military might. There are also interesting practical considerations. Egyptian armies on campaign needed supply lines, food stores that would be vulnerable to rodent damage. Military encampments would have benefited from having cats to protect these supplies. Whether cats actually accompanied armies in significant numbers is unknown. No ancient text describes military logistics in that level of detail, but it's plausible that at least some camp followers might have been feline. The psychological dimension of cat reverence in military contexts shouldn't be underestimated. Egyptian soldiers believed they were fighting with divine support, that the gods, including Bastet, were on their side. This confidence could be a genuine military advantage, affecting morale and courage in battle. Conversely, anything that suggested the gods were displeased, such as bad omens involving cats, could damage morale. There are accounts of Egyptian military expeditions taking omens from animal behavior before battles, and cats were among the animals observed. A cat behaving unusually, particularly at a temple or military camp, might be interpreted as a divine message. Priests accompanying military campaigns would be consulted to interpret such signs, and their interpretations could influence military decisions. The aftermath of the Persian conquest and later foreign rulers also reveals the military dimension of cat worship. The Ptolemaic rulers maintained Egyptian religious traditions, partly to ensure the loyalty of Egyptian troops in their armies. Supporting temples, including Bastet's sanctuaries, and respecting sacred animals was a way of securing the cultural legitimacy needed to command Egyptian soldiers effectively. In broader terms, the story of cats in Egyptian military history illustrates an important principle. Cultural beliefs are never purely abstract or spiritual. They have real-world consequences. The Egyptians' devotion to cats shaped their psychology, their decision-making, their willingness to take certain actions or avoid others. An enemy who understood this had a weapon more subtle and powerful than bronze or iron. As you settle deeper into restful calm, let the dramatic images fade, the clash of battle, the calculated tactics, the weight of empire. Return instead to something simpler and more fundamental. A soldier, far from home on the Egyptian frontier, writes a letter back to his family. He mentions their cat, asks if it's still keeping the grain store free of mice, says he's looking forward to coming home and hearing it purr again. In the midst of political upheaval and military campaigns, in a life defined by duty and danger, the thought of that small domestic comfort, a cat waiting at home, is a connection to peace, to normalcy, to the life worth defending. The great forces of history, empires rising and falling, battles won and lost, all of it matters less in this quiet moment than the simple truth that home is where the cat is, where the divine and the domestic meet in the warm vibration of purring contentment. Chapter 13, The Final Meow, Reflections on an Eternal Bond. What can we learn from the ancient Egyptians' relationship with cats, and how does their story connect to our lives today? As we come to the end of this long journey through ancient history, it's time to reflect on the deeper meanings and the lasting truths that emerge from this remarkable civilization's love affair with felines. The ancient Egyptians saw something in cats that transcended practical utility. Yes, cats protected grain stores from rodents, and that was valuable, but the reverence went so far beyond economic calculation. The Egyptians recognized in cats a quality that spoke to something fundamental about existence itself. The presence of grace in the mundane, the manifestation of power in a small, soft-furred body, the mystery of consciousness that looks out from eyes that glow with reflected light. When a mother in ancient Thebes put a Bastet amulet around her child's neck, she was performing an act that connected her to cosmic forces, to the goddess who fought chaos, to the eternal struggle between order and disorder. But she was also doing something beautifully, simply human, trying to protect her child with every tool available, including faith and the belief that divine forces cared about the safety of one small life. That combination of cosmic significance and intimate personal care is what made Egyptian religion so powerful. The same dual quality appears in how Egyptians treated cats themselves. The temple complexes breeding cats for mummification operated on an industrial scale, producing thousands upon thousands of offerings. This seems cold, mechanical, but individual families also loved their personal cats, buried them with care, mourned them with genuine grief, commissioned sarcophagi, and wrote affectionate names in hieroglyphs. Both practices coexisted because both expressed truth about the human relationship with the sacred. We might find the mass mummification of cats disturbing from our modern perspective, and there's validity to that reaction. The value system that could kill young cats as religious offerings operates on principles different from contemporary animal welfare ethics. But we should be careful about judging too harshly. The Egyptians believed they were transforming cats into eternal divine messengers, giving them an afterlife of spiritual significance. Their intention was not cruelty but devotion, however much their practices might trouble us today. What's perhaps most remarkable is how the core of the relationship, the bond between human and cat, remained constant across all the religious and cultural complexity. Whether it was a peasant farmer sharing his fish with the cat that kept his grain safe, or a queen keeping a beloved pet in her palace chambers, or a priest caring for the sacred cats in Bastet's temple, the fundamental dynamic was the same. Humans and cats living together, benefiting each other, and in the process, creating something that felt meaningful, even sacred. This bond survived everything. It survived the end of pharaonic rule, the Greek conquest, the Roman occupation, the triumph of Christianity, the Islamic period, modernization, colonialism, and revolution. Through all these massive historical transformations, cats remained in Egyptian homes. The theology changed completely. The gods were replaced. Entire worldviews were overturned. But cats and humans continued their ancient partnership. That continuity tells us something important about the nature of this relationship. It's not dependent on any particular religious framework, even though it can be expressed through religion powerfully. The bond between humans and cats exists at a more fundamental level, somewhere in the place where two different species discover they can share space, share life, and find mutual benefit and even affection. The Egyptians were among the first to formalize this relationship, to build an entire theological and cultural system around it. They were early adopters, we might say, of the domestic cat. But what they discovered in that adoption, we continue to discover today. Every time a cat chooses to settle on our lap, every time we hear that distinctive purr that signifies contentment, every time we watch a cat move with that liquid grace that seems to belong to another realm entirely. Modern cat owners, whether they realize it or not, are heirs to the Egyptians. When you set out food for your cat, you're repeating a ritual that stretches back thousands of years. When you make sure your cat has a comfortable place to sleep, you're showing the same care that ancient Egyptians showed. When you take your cat to a veterinarian for medical care, you're demonstrating the same commitment to cat welfare that led wealthy Egyptians to commission healing rituals and that led Prince Thutmose to create a limestone sarcophagus for Meow. The main difference is theological language, not actual practice. An ancient Egyptian might say they were honoring Bastet by caring for their cat. A modern person might say they love their pet. But the actions are remarkably similar, and perhaps the emotional reality is closer than the different words suggest. When the ancient Egyptians spoke of divine blessing, and when the modern person speaks of the joy a pet brings, they might be describing the same experience in different vocabularies. There's a lesson here about finding the sacred in the everyday. The ancient Egyptians didn't need to imagine distant, abstract gods. Their gods were present in the sunlight, in the Nile's flood, in the growth of crops, and in the cat sleeping by the hearth. This is a very grounded, practical kind of spirituality, one that finds divinity in the world as it actually exists rather than in some separate supernatural realm. Modern secular culture often assumes that losing traditional religious frameworks means losing access to a sense of the sacred. But the Egyptian example suggests otherwise. The sacred can be present in the relationship between human and animal, in the recognition of beauty and grace, in the appreciation of consciousness different from our own yet somehow able to connect with ours. You don't need to believe in Bastet as a literal goddess to experience something profound when a cat trusts you enough to fall asleep in your presence. The ancient Egyptians also teach us about the importance of other species in human life. They understood that humans don't exist in isolation, that we're part of a larger web of life, and that our well-being is connected to our relationships with other creatures. The health of a household was tied to its cat. The prosperity of the land was tied to the goddess who took feline form. Everything was connected. This holistic worldview contrasts with modern tendencies toward isolation and human-centeredness. We've gained a great deal through scientific understanding and technological advancement, but we've sometimes lost sight of our place within nature. The Egyptians, for all their limits in scientific knowledge, understood something important about ecological interconnection. They knew that cats served vital functions in their agricultural system, and they honoured that importance by elevating cats to sacred status. As your mind grows quieter and sleep approaches, let these reflections settle gently. The story of Bastet and the sacred cats of ancient Egypt is ultimately a story about connection, about how different beings can share a world and make it better for each other, about how the practical and the spiritual can intertwine until they're inseparable, about how some bonds transcend time and culture and speak to something fundamental in what it means to be alive and aware and capable of relationship. Somewhere in Egypt tonight, in the land where the Nile still flows as it has for millions of years, there are cats. Some are pets in modern apartments in Cairo or Alexandria. Some are street cats, navigating ancient alleyways in cities built on layers of human habitation stretching back millennia. Some live in villages not far from where Bubastis once stood in its glory. These cats know nothing of Bastet or of the temples that once honoured them. They live their cat lives, hunting, sleeping, grooming, interacting with humans in ways cats have done for thousands of years. And yet, in a sense, they carry forward the legacy. Every purr is an echo of ancient times. Every graceful movement replicates the gestures that ancient Egyptians saw as divine. Every moment of connection between a cat and a human in modern Egypt continues a relationship that shaped one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The temples are ruins, the mummies are in museums, the goddess is no longer worshipped, but the cats remain. Living proof that some things are more enduring than empires, more fundamental than theology, more real than any story we tell about them. The ancient Egyptians looked at cats and saw gods. We might use different language, but when we look at our cats, when we appreciate their mysterious beauty, their independence and affection, their capacity to be both wild and domestic, we're seeing what they saw. The experience transcends the explanation. The bond exists beyond the words we use to describe it. And so we reach the end of this long night's journey through ancient Egypt, through temples and tombs, through festivals and battles, through theology and daily life, all of it revolving around the presence of cats, those small, remarkable creatures who domesticated themselves and in doing so changed human history. May you sleep well, may your dreams be peaceful, and if you have a cat near you, may its purring carry you gently into sleep. That same sound that comforted ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago, the sound of contentment, the vibration of presence, the eternal voice of the cat saying simply, "I am here, you are safe, all is well."